The growth of the slave trade. During the next 2 centuries, the trade in slaves increased by massive proportions. Beginning in the 16th century, the trade in African slaves to the Americas became a major source of profit to European merchants. For example, we can see routes taken by slave trading ships, as well as the territories and ports of call of European powers in the 17th century. And from the 16th, 17th, and even 18th and 19th centuries, we have an exponential growth in the number of slaves that are transported across the Atlantic Ocean, from hundreds of thousands to millions of slaves. And the import and transport of slaves during this time from the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, even going from the 18th and 19th century, there's a extreme increase in the number of slaves that were sold and traded at the time. During the the total climbed beyond 1 million in the 17th century and jumped to 6 million in the 18th century, when the trade spread from West and Central Africa to East Africa. Even during the 19th century, when Great Britain and a number of other European countries attempted to end the slave trade, nearly 2 million humans were exported. It has been estimated that altogether as many as 10 million African slaves were transported to the Americas between the early 16th century and the late 19th century. As many as 2 million were exported to other areas during the same time period. Concerning the Middle Passage, one reason for these astonishing numbers, of course, was the tragically high death rate. In what is often called the Middle Passage, the arduous voyage from Africa to the Americas, losses were frequently appalling, although figures on the number of slaves who died on the journey are almost entirely speculative. During the first shipments, up to 1/3 of the human cargo may have died of disease or malnourishment. Even among crew members, mortality rates were sometimes as high as 1 in 4. Later merchants became more efficient and reduced losses to about 10%. Still, the future slaves were treated inhumanely, chained together in the holds of ships, reeking with stench of human waste and diseases carried by vermin. Ironically, African slaves who survived the brutal voyage fared somewhat better than whites after their arrival. Mortality rates for Europeans in the West Indies were 10 to 20 times higher than in Europe, and death rates for those newly arrived in the islands averaged more than 125 per 1,000 annually. But the figure for Africans, many of whom had developed at least a partial immunity to yellow fever, was only about 30 per 1,000. The reason for the staggering death rates was clearly more than maltreatment, although that was certainly a factor. As we have seen, the transmission of diseases from one continent to another brought high death rates among those lacking immunity. African slaves were somewhat less susceptible to European diseases than the American Indian populations. Indeed, they seem to have possessed a degree of immunity, perhaps because their ancestors had developed antibodies to diseases common to the Old World from the centuries of contact via the trans-Saharan trade. The Africans would not have had immunity to Native American diseases, however. And again, one of the 12 million slaves shipped from Africa, of the 12 million slaves shipped to Africa to other parts of the world, some passed through a doorway on Gorée, a small island in a bay just off the coast of Senegal near Cape Verde. Beginning in the 16th century, European traders shipped Africans from this region to the Americas to be used as slave labor on sugar plantations. Some victims were kept in a prison on the island, which was first occupied by the Portuguese and later by the Dutch, the British, and the French. Gorée also served as an entrepot and a source of supplies for ships passing along the western coast of Africa. The sign by the doorway read, quote, "From this door they would embark on a voyage with no return, eyes fixed on an infinity of suffering," end quote. The mortality rates were higher for immigrants than for individuals born in the Americas, who as children gradually developed at least a partial immunity to many diseases. Death rates for native-born slaves tended to be significantly lower than for recent arrivals, which raises the question of why the slave population did not begin to rise after the initial impact of settlement had worn off. The answer appears to be a matter of economics. In the first place, only half as many women were enslaved as men. Birth rates for women living in slavery were very low, and infant mortality was extremely high. In the second place, as long as the price of slaves was low, many slave owners in the West Indies apparently believed that purchasing a new slave was less expensive than raising a child from birth to working age at adolescence. After the price of slaves began to rise during the 18th century, plantation owners started to devote more efforts to replenish the supply of workers by natural methods. Sources of slaves. Slaves were obtained by traditional means. In other words, as mentioned earlier, before the coming of the Europeans, most slaves in Africa were prisoners or war captives or had inherited their status. When Europeans first began to take part in the slave trade, they would normally purchase slaves from local African merchants at the infamous slave markets in exchange for gold, guns, or other European manufactured goods such as textiles or copper or iron utensils. At first, local slave traders obtained their supply from nearby regions, but as demand increased, they had to move further inland to find their victims. In a few cases, local rulers became concerned about the impact of the slave trade on the political and social well-being of their societies. As a general rule, however, the local monarchs viewed the slave trade as a source of income, and many launched forays against defenseless villages in search of unsuspecting victims. Historians once thought that Europeans controlled the terms of the slave trade and were able to obtain victims at bargain prices. Recently, however, it has become clear that the African intermediaries, private merchants, local elites, and trading state monopolies were very active in the process and were often able to dictate the price, volume, and availability of slaves to European purchasers. The majority of the slaves sold to European buyers were males. Females who were in great demand in Africa and on the trans-Saharan trade tended to be reserved for those markets. And again, the African slave merchants were often paid in various types of imported goods, including East Asian textiles, highly desired for their bright colors and durability, furniture, and other manufactured products. Until the end of the 17th century, the Portuguese preferred gold to slaves and would sometimes pay for the gold by selling slaves to African kingdoms that were short of labor. And in fact, not until the beginning of the 18th century did slaves surpass gold and ivory as the continent's leading exports. The effects of the slave trade. The effects of the slave trade varied from area to area. It might be assumed that apart from the tragic effects of the lives of individual victims and their families, the practice would have led to the depopulation of vast areas of the continent. This did occur in some areas, notably in modern Angola, south of the mouth of the Congo River, and in thinly populated regions in East Africa, but it was less true in West Africa. Their high birth rates were often able to counterbalance the loss of able-bodied adults, and the introduction of new crops from the Americas, such as maize, peanuts, and others, led to an increase in food production that made it possible to support a larger population. One of the many cruel ironies of history is that while the institution of slavery was a tragedy for many, it benefited others. Still, a very interesting phenomenon. Still, there is no denying the reality that from a moral point of view, the slave trade represented a tragic loss for millions of Africans, not only for the individual victims, but also for their families. One of the more poignant aspects of the trade is that as many as 20% of those that were sold to European slavers were children, a statistic that may be partly explained by the fact that many European countries enacted regulations that permitted more children than adults to be transported aboard the ships. Beyond the effects on individual Africans and their families, the slave trade also had a corrosive impact on the structure of society as a whole. Another consequence of the arrival of the Europeans was the introduction of firearms into the African continent. As the European demand for slaves steadily increased, African slave traders began to use their newly purchased guns to raid neighboring villages in search of captives, initiating a chain of violence that rapidly extended into the interior and created a climate of fear and insecurity throughout the region. Old polities were undermined, and new regimes ruled by rapacious merchant princes began to proliferate on the coast. And so, how did Europeans justify cruelty of such epidemic proportions? In some cases, they rationalized that slave traders were only carrying out a tradition that had existed for centuries before throughout the Mediterranean and African world. And in others, they eased their consciences by noting that slaves brought from Africa would now be exposed to the Christian faith and would be able to replace American Indian workers, many of whom were considered too physically fragile for the heavy human labor that was involved in cutting sugarcane. The political and social structures in a changing continent. Of course, the Western economic penetration of Africa had other dislocating effects. As in other parts of the non-Western world, the importation of manufactured goods from European soil undermined the foundations of local cottage industries and impoverished countless families. The demand for slaves and the introduction of firearms intensified political instability and civil strife. At the same time, the impact of the Europeans should not be exaggerated. Only in a few isolated areas, such as South Africa and Mozambique, were permanent European settlements established. Elsewhere, at the insistence of African rulers and merchants, European influence generally did not penetrate beyond the coastal regions. Nevertheless, inland areas were often affected by events taking place elsewhere. In the Western Sahara, for example, the diversion of trade routes toward the coast led to the weakening of old Songhai Empire, trading empire, and its eventual conquest by a vigorous new Moroccan dynasty in the late 16th century. Morocco had long hopes to expand its influence into the Sahara in order to seize control over the commerce in gold and salt. And in 1590, Moroccan forces defeated Songhai's army at Gao on the Niger River and then occupied the great caravan center of Timbuktu. Even after the departure of the invaders, Songhai was beyond recovery, and the next 2 centuries were marked by ongoing strife between divergent states and intense competition between Muslims in the cities and towns and adherents of traditional African religions in rural areas, and the disintegration of the Songhai Empire. European influence had a more direct impact along the coast of West Africa, especially in the vicinity of European forts such as Dakar and Sierra Leone, but no European colonies were established there before 1800. Most of the numerous African states in the area from Cape Verde to the delta of the Niger River were sufficiently strong to resist Western encroachments, and they often allied with each other to force European purchasers to respect their monopoly over trading operations. Some, like the powerful Ashanti Kingdom, established in 1680 on the Gold Coast, profited substantially from the rise in seaborne commerce. Some states, particularly along the so-called Slave Coast, in what is now Benin and Togo, or in the densely populated Niger River Delta, took an active part in the slave trade. The demands of slavery and the temptations of economic profit also contributed to the increase in conflict among the states in the area. This was especially true in the region of the Congo River, where Portuguese activities eventually led to the splintering of the state of Congo and 2 centuries of rivalry and internal strife among the successor states in the area. A similar pattern developed in East Africa, where Portuguese activities led to the decline and the eventual collapse of the trying to figure out how to, it's Mwene Mutapa. And so Mwene Mutapa, a similar pattern developed in East Africa, where Portuguese activities led to the decline and eventual collapse of the Mwene Mutapa. Northward along the coast in present-day Kenya and Tanzania, African rulers assisted by Arab forces from Oman and Muscat in the Arabian Peninsula expelled the Portuguese from Mombasa in the year 1698. Swahili culture now regained some of the dynamism it had possessed before the arrival of Vasco da Gama and his successors, but with much shipping now diverted southward to the route around the Cape of Good Hope. The commerce of the area never completely recovered and was increasingly dependent on the export of slaves and ivory attained through contacts with African states in the interior of Africa. In our next reading, before we move on to the transformation of Europe, of Reformation of the 16th century, Europe from the middle 16th to middle 17th, England and limited monarchy, and starting to focus on the flourishing of European culture in the 16th and 17th centuries and beyond. But next we will talk about Southeast Asia and the spice trade.